The air outside the Capitol was heavy with a mixture of exhilaration and uncertainty. Crowds of thousands gathered, waving their flags and chanting slogans. The inauguration of Donald Trump as the 47th President of the United States was more than a political event. It was a moment that embodied the deep divides and lingering hopes of a nation standing at a crossroads. The brisk January wind carried with it not only the sound of jubilant cheers but also murmurs of unease. As the official ceremony began, the camera panned over familiar faces. Members of Congress, former presidents, and dignitaries took their places, their expressions ranging from somber reflection to cautious optimism. Amidst the dignitaries stood the Trump family, a picture of unity and strength. Melania Trump, poised and regal in a tailored white coat, stood with a quiet elegance that seemed to command the attention of the crowd. Beside her, Barron Trump stood tall, his striking height of nearly 7 feet making him impossible to overlook. At only 18, he had the presence of someone older, yet his face carried the reserved demeanor of a young man still grappling with his place in the spotlight. Donald Trump stepped up to the podium, his larger-than-life presence dominating the stage. His booming voice echoed across the plaza as he began his inaugural address. Today, he declared, his tone unwavering, we reaffirm our commitment to the greatness of this nation. We will face challenges head-on, and together, we will prevail. The crowd erupted in applause, but amidst the cheers, there were faint undercurrents of skepticism. Standing beside his father, Barron watched intently. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, but it was his posture, upright yet slightly hesitant, that spoke volumes. His eyes darted across the sea of faces, his thoughts veiled behind a stoic expression. What was going through his mind as his father delivered those powerful words? Did he feel pride, or perhaps the weight of expectation that comes with being the son of a man so polarizing? "Mom," Barron whispered softly, his voice barely audible over the roaring applause. Melania turned to him, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and concern. "What is it, Barron?" she asked, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I've been thinking," he began hesitantly, his voice faltering, "about what Dad is saying, about what it really means for all of us. Do you think people believe it? That they can come together again?" Melania paused, her gaze searching his face for a moment. "I think," she replied carefully, "that it's not about whether they believe it now, but whether they're willing to try. Sometimes, Barron, hope is all we have." Her words lingered in the air between them as Donald Trump continued his speech. Each sentence was delivered with conviction, but to Barron, it felt like more than just words. It felt like a challenge, one that he couldn't ignore. As the president finished his address and stepped back from the podium, the applause reached a thunderous crescendo. Barron's heart raced. He looked up at his father, whose expression was one of triumph, and then back at the crowd. There was something in their faces, something unspoken. Pride, yes, but also doubt. Barron adjusted his tie nervously, his hands trembling slightly. "Maybe it's time," he thought to himself. "Maybe I need to say something too." "Baron." Melania's voice pulled him back to the present. "Are you allrecht?" He nodded, though the lump in his throat said otherwise. I think there's more to say," he murmured. Melania's eyes widened, and for a moment, she seemed unsure of how to respond. But then with a gentle smile she said, "If that's what you feel, then you should say it." As the applause began to wane, Barron took a step forward. The movement was subtle at first, as though he were testing the waters. The crowd's cheers softened into murmurs of curiosity, and even his family seemed momentarily taken aback. Donald Trump turned to his son, his expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. "What are you doing, son?" Donald asked, his voice low but firm. Barron met his father's gaze, a rare determination shining in his eyes. "I need to speak," he said simply. For a brief moment, the world seemed to pause. Then, as Barron made his way to the podium, the murmurs grew louder. People exchanged puzzled looks, unsure of what was about to unfold. Standing before the microphone, Barron took a deep breath, the faint sound of it caught by the microphones. The crowd fell silent, their collective anticipation palpable. He glanced at his family, drawing strength from their presence, and then turned back to face the sea of faces before him. "Today," he began, his voice steady but soft, "is about more than a presidency. It's about us, all of us." The words hung in the air, their simplicity carrying a weight that no one had expected. In that moment, Barron Trump, the quiet, reserved son of a larger-than-life figure, had taken the stage in a way no one could have foreseen. The murmurs grew louder as Barron Trump stood behind the podium. The vast sea of faces before him, once cheering and confident, now wore expressions of curiosity mixed with confusion. What could the youngest Trump, a figure known more for his silence than his speech, possibly have to say? And why now? The crisp January air seemed to hold its breath, wrapping the crowd in an eerie quiet. From where she stood, Melania Trump watched her son with an intensity only a mother could muster. Her hands clasped tightly in front of her, she whispered to herself, "Be strong, Barron. Say what's in your heart." Donald Trump stood a few steps behind, his brows furrowed in an expression that was both curious and proud. He leaned slightly toward Melania and murmured, "Did you know he was going to do this?" "No," she replied softly, her voice betraying her mixture of concern and pride. "But maybe it's time we all listen." Barron's fingers gripped the edges of the podium as he steadied himself. He was aware of his height, his imposing figure now amplified by the significance of the moment, but inside he felt small, just an 18-year-old trying to speak his truth. Taking another deep breath, he began. "Today," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that surprised even himself, "marks more than just a new chapter for my father. It's a new chapter for all of us." His words, though simple, rippled through the crowd, their tone strikingly different from the bold declarations that had come before. There was no grandiosity, no fiery rhetoric. Instead, there was an unmistakable honesty, a rawness that seemed to catch the audience off guard. "I know many of you see me and think you already know my story," Barron continued, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "You see my last name, my family, and you think you know who I am. But the truth is, I've spent most of my life in the shadows, watching, listening, and trying to understand a country that feels more divided than ever." In the crowd, a woman wearing a red "Make America Great Again" hat whispered to her husband, "He's just a kid. What does he know about division?" But as Barron's voice grew steadier, even she leaned in, unable to ignore the sincerity in his tone. "For years I stayed silent," Barron admitted, his eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the crowd. "I thought it wasn't my place to speak. I thought, what difference could I make? But staying silent hasn't solved anything. It's only made things worse. We've let anger and fear define us for too long, and it's tearing us apart." A low murmur rippled through the crowd, not of dissent, but of reflection. In their seats, people shifted, some nodding subtly, others folding their arms as if trying to guard themselves against the vulnerability his words invoked. From behind, Donald Trump's gaze softened. His son's words weren't polished nor rehearsed, but they carried an authenticity that even he, a seasoned speaker, couldn't deny. He whispered to Melania, "He's not just speaking to them, he's speaking for them." Barron paused, his hands relaxing slightly as he glanced briefly at his family behind him. Melania gave him a small nod of encouragement, and Donald stood firm, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable but attentive. Turning back to the microphone, Barron's voice took on a tone of quiet determination. "We don't have to agree on everything," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "But we do have to agree on one thing, that the future we want for this country is worth fighting for. And that fight doesn't start with shouting or pointing fingers. It starts with listening." For a moment, the silence was deafening. Even the faint hum of the wind seemed to fade, leaving nothing but Barron's words hanging in the air. In the crowd, an older man wearing a veteran's hat wiped his eyes discreetly. Nearby, a young woman clutched her phone, live-streaming the moment with trembling hands. Barron continued, his voice now carrying an emotional depth that reached even the farthest corners of the plaza. "I've heard stories from people who feel unheard, unseen, and forgotten. And I've seen the pain that division causes, not just on the news, but in people's lives, in their eyes. It doesn't have to be this way. We don't have to let anger and fear tear us apart." He paused again, his breath visible in the cold air as he looked over the crowd. For the first time, his usually reserved face showed a flicker of vulnerability, but it only added to the weight of his words. "If my generation is to inherit this country," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I ask one thing, let us inherit a country we can be proud of." As he stepped back from the podium, the silence lingered, a collective pause as the audience absorbed what they had just heard. Then, slowly, the applause began. It wasn't explosive or frantic. It was measured, thoughtful, almost reverent. As the applause rippled across the crowd, Barron Trump stood still, his tall frame silhouetted against the Capitol's stately backdrop. The applause wasn't the usual explosive kind heard at political rallies. It was deliberate, thoughtful, and even tinged with awe. In that moment, the youngest Trump had achieved something rare, a quiet resonance that went beyond politics. Melania stepped closer to Barron, her hand brushing lightly against his arm. "You spoke beautifully," she whispered, her voice trembling with pride. "You didn't just speak to them, Barron. You reached them." Barron looked at her, his expression unreadable but his eyes reflecting a flicker of relief. "Do you think they'll understand?" he asked quietly. "Do you think it'll matter?" Melania held his gaze for a moment before answering. "It already does. Look at them." Barron turned his attention back to the crowd. Faces that had been hardened with skepticism now softened with reflection. He saw a man in his late 60s, his veteran's cap tilted forward, holding his wife's hand as tears glistened in his eyes. A young couple stood nearby, their arms around each other, nodding silently as if acknowledging a truth they hadn't considered before. The weight of what he had just done began to sink in. From behind, Donald Trump stepped forward and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. His usual commanding presence was tempered with a rare humility. "You've done something big here, son," he said, his voice low. "Bigger than you realize." Barron didn't respond right away. Instead, he took in the crowd, the weight of their collective silence lingering like a quiet storm. He could feel their emotions, the mixture of hope, hesitation, and perhaps even the smallest spark of belief. As the applause grew louder, the cameras zoomed in on Barron's face. Social media feeds were already ablaze with clips of his speech, hashtags like #Barron Trump speech and #Voice of Unity trending across platforms. Journalists and commentators scrambled to interpret his words, but in this moment, Barron wasn't concerned with how his speech would be analyzed. He was more preoccupied with the possibility that it might inspire even a handful of people to think differently. A few steps away, Ivanka Trump stood with her arms crossed, her face softened by an expression of quiet admiration. She leaned toward Eric, who stood beside her, and whispered, "I've never seen him like this. He's always been so reserved." Eric nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "He's showing the world who he really is," he said. "It's about time." As the crowd began to settle, the mood shifted from awe to anticipation. People weren't just applauding anymore, they were leaning into the moment, waiting to see what might come next. Barron felt it too, that unspoken question hanging in the air, what now? Gathering himself, Barron turned slightly toward his family. "I think I need to step back," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet humility. "I've said what I needed to say." Donald gave him a firm nod. "You've done more than enough," he said, a rare warmth in his tone. Melania smiled at her son, her hand still resting lightly on his arm. "You've done something brave today," she said. "You reminded them of what matters." Barron took one last look at the crowd before stepping away from the podium. As he did, the applause swelled again, this time deeper, more resonant. It was a sound that carried gratitude, respect, and perhaps a touch of hope. Walking back to his family, Barron felt the enormity of the moment settle into his chest. He wasn't a polished politician, nor was he someone seeking the spotlight. He was just a young man who had spoken from his heart, and somehow, that had been enough. The rest of the ceremony unfolded in the usual pomp and circumstance, but for many in the crowd, the highlight had already passed. Conversations buzzed quietly among the audience, each group reflecting on Barron's unexpected words. Near the front, a man in his early 70s turned to his wife. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I never thought I'd be moved by a kid like that. But he's right. It's time we started listening." His wife nodded, squeezing his hand. "Maybe it's not too late," she said softly. Back on stage, the Trump family gathered for photos, their expressions a mixture of pride and composure. Barron stood slightly apart, his height making him stand out even in the family's tightly knit formation. He caught Melania's eye, and she smiled, mouthing the words, "Well done." As the ceremony concluded, the crowd slowly dispersed, but the echoes of Barron's speech lingered. People walked away not with the usual chatter of political discourse, but with a shared sense of something deeper, a rare moment of sincerity that had transcended the usual noise of the day. In the hours that followed, Barron's words continued to ripple outward. Clips of his speech flooded social media, sparking debates, discussions, and moments of reflection. Some criticized his youth and privilege, questioning whether his words carried weight. But others, particularly younger generations, felt an undeniable connection to his message. Back at the Capitol, as Barron prepared to leave with his family, he glanced out one last time at the steps where he had stood. He knew the moment would be dissected, praised, and criticized. But for now, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. He had stepped out of the shadows, not for himself, but for something bigger. As they walked to the awaiting motorcade, Melania touched Barron's arm lightly. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Barron gave her a small, genuine smile. "Thanks, Mom," he replied. "I just hope it makes a difference." Inside the car, Barron sat quietly, his hands resting on his lap, his mind replaying the words he had spoken. Melania glanced at him from her seat, sensing the mixture of relief and uncertainty radiating from her son. "You've done something important today, Barron," she said gently, breaking the silence. Barron turned to her, his expression a blend of humility and doubt. "Do you really think it'll matter?" he asked softly. "I mean, I spoke from my heart, but will anyone actually listen?" Donald Trump, seated across from them, looked up from his phone, his usual air of confidence tempered with a rare sincerity. "They'll listen," he said firmly. "Trust me, son. Words like yours don't just fade away." Barron nodded, but remained quiet. Deep down, he hoped his father was right, though a part of him feared that the moment might be forgotten amid the noise of politics and division. As the day unfolded, the speech began to take on a life of its own. Social media platforms were flooded with clips of Barron's unexpected address. TikTok users shared videos dissecting his words, their captions filled with phrases like, "the speech we didn't know we needed," and "a voice of reason in chaotic times." On Twitter, hashtags like #Barron Trump speech and #Voice of Unity began trending nationally, drawing both praise and skepticism. In one suburban home in Ohio, a family sat around their dining table, watching the speech on their TV. The father, a retired factory worker, shook his head slowly as Barron's voice filled the room. "You know," he said, his voice tinged with emotion, "I didn't expect to hear something like this today. That boy, he's got a point." His teenage granddaughter, seated across from him, looked up from her phone. "It's weird," she admitted. "I don't usually pay attention to political stuff, but I don't know." He sounded real. Like he actually cared. The grandfather nodded, his eyes glistening slightly. "Maybe we've all forgotten how to care," he murmured. "Maybe it's time we start." Meanwhile, news outlets scrambled to cover the unexpected moment. Cable news channels replayed Barron's speech in full, inviting analysts and commentators to weigh in. Conservative networks lauded his ability to transcend political divides, calling him a bridge between generations. Liberal platforms, while more skeptical, acknowledged the sincerity of his message, with one commentator remarking, "You don't have to agree with his family's politics to see the value in what he said." Even within the Trump family, Barron's decision to speak had sparked quiet conversations. Ivanka, still processing the events of the day, sat with her husband Jared later that evening. "I've always known Barron was thoughtful," she said, sipping her tea, "but today, he showed us all a depth we hadn't seen before." Jared nodded. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. He wasn't trying to win anyone over, he was just being honest. Ivanka smiled faintly, her mind replaying the moment when her younger brother had stepped forward. "Maybe that's what we've been missing all along," she said quietly. Honesty. Elsewhere, the reactions were equally profound. In San Diego, a high school teacher paused her lesson to play the speech for her students. As Barron's voice filled the classroom, the students listened intently, many of them hearing his words for the first time. When the video ended, one student raised his hand. "Do you think he's right, Miss Parker?" he asked. "That we can actually fix things by listening to each other?" The teacher smiled, her heart warmed by the question. "I think it's a start," she replied. "And sometimes, starting is the hardest part." But not all reactions were positive. Critics took to social media and television to question Barron's motives. "It's easy for someone raised in privilege to talk about unity," one prominent commentator tweeted. "Let's see him live a day in the shoes of an ordinary American." The backlash sparked its own counter-response. Supporters defended Barron, arguing that his youth and sincerity made his words worth considering. "It's not about where he comes from," one viral post read. "It's about where he wants us all to go." As night fell, the nation continued to grapple with the weight of Barron's message. In a small diner in Arizona, an elderly woman sat alone, her cup of coffee growing cold as she stared at the small TV mounted in the corner. The news was replaying clips of the speech, and she watched with a quiet intensity. After a moment, she whispered to herself, maybe he's right. Maybe it's not too late for us. Back in Washington, as the Trump family settled into their evening routine, Barron found himself alone in his room. Sitting by the window, he looked out at the city lights, his mind racing. He thought about the faces in the crowd, the applause, the weight of their expectations. I hope I said the right thing, he muttered to himself. I hope it makes a difference. From the doorway, Melania's voice broke the silence. It already has, she said softly, stepping into the room. Barron turned to her, his eyes searching hers for reassurance. How do you know? He asked. She smiled gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. Because people are talking, she said. And when they talk, they listen. That's how it begins. Barron nodded, her words offering a small but powerful comfort. As he turned back to the window, he allowed himself a rare moment of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, his words had sparked something greater than himself. By the following morning, the echoes of Barron Trump's speech had grown louder, transforming from a ripple into a wave that swept across the nation. Conversations that began in living rooms and coffee shops were now taking place on college campuses, community centers, and even corporate boardrooms. People of all ages and backgrounds were engaging in dialogue, some for the first time in years. At a small community library in Cincinnati, a grassroots group had gathered to discuss what they called common ground. Inspired by Barron's speech, the group, composed of neighbors with differing political views, sat in a circle, sharing their stories. I'll admit, said a middle-aged man wearing a plaid shirt, his voice tinged with hesitation, when I first saw that kid on stage, I thought, what could he possibly know about the real world? But then he started talking about listening instead of shouting. And it hit me, I haven't listened to my brother in years. All we do is argue. An older woman with glasses resting on the tip of her nose nodded solemnly. It's the same with my daughter, she said. We don't even talk during the holidays anymore. But when Barron said that change starts with us, it made me realize that maybe I'm part of the problem. The group fell into a reflective silence before a young woman, barely out of her 20s, spoke up. It's hard though, she said, her voice soft but steady. Sometimes it feels like the divide is just too wide. But maybe he's right. Maybe we don't have to fix everything all at once. Maybe we just start small. Her words hung in the air, the simplicity of her statement resonating deeply. Slowly, one by one, the group members nodded. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. Across the country in San Diego, a group of high school students was also taking action. Their teacher, Miss Parker, had played Barron's speech for them the previous day, and the impact was immediate. By morning, a group of 10 students had organized a community forum to bring together people of different political ideologies to discuss local issues. This isn't about proving who's right or wrong, said Liam, a senior who had taken the lead in organizing the event. It's about understanding why we all feel the way we do. Barron said we need to listen, so let's start there. The forum was held in the school gymnasium, and though it was modest in scale, the energy in the room was palpable. Parents, teachers, and students came together, many of them nervous but curious. As they sat down and began sharing their thoughts, the room slowly filled with the sounds of honest, if sometimes uncomfortable conversations. I don't think we'll solve everything tonight, Liam admitted as the event concluded. But at least we're talking. That's more than we've done in a long time. Meanwhile, on social media, Barron's words continued to resonate. TikTok videos tagged with hashtag Barron Speech Challenge encouraged users to share how they were personally contributing to bridging divides. From volunteering at shelters to mentoring younger students, people began documenting their small acts of unity. One video, posted by a college student in Arizona, showed her calling her estranged father for the first time in years. Barron's speech made me realize how much I've missed, she said in the caption. This is me trying to fix that. The video quickly went viral, garnering millions of views and thousands of comments. Some were supportive, while others questioned whether such actions could make a real difference. But for those who watched, the message was clear, even the smallest step mattered. Not everyone, however, was moved by Barron's words. Prominent critics took to news networks, questioning the authenticity of his message. It's easy for someone born into privilege to talk about unity, one commentator argued. He's never had to struggle like ordinary Americans. The backlash sparked its own wave of responses. Supporters of Barron's speech defended him, insisting that sincerity wasn't exclusive to one's background. "It's not about where he comes from," one op-ed read. "It's about where he's asking us all to go." Even within the Trump family, the impact of Barron's speech was evident. Ivanka, ever the diplomat, spoke about her younger brother during a rare interview. "He's always been thoughtful," she said, her voice filled with pride. "But yesterday, he showed us all a side of him we hadn't seen before. He reminded us that sometimes, the quietest voices can speak the loudest." Eric Trump echoed her sentiment. "He's always been the one who listens," he said. And yesterday, he proved that listening can be just as powerful as speaking. At the Capitol, the reverberations of Barron's speech reached even the halls of Congress. Several lawmakers, inspired by his words, called for bipartisan meetings to address pressing issues. "If an 18-year-old can call for unity," one senator remarked, "then so can we." Churches and synagogues wove his message into their sermons, urging their congregations to embrace empathy and understanding. Corporate leaders began using excerpts from his speech in team-building exercises, emphasizing the importance of collaboration and mutual respect in the workplace. Back in New York, Barron sat quietly in his room, scrolling through the countless articles, posts, and videos discussing his speech. He had never sought the spotlight, but now, he found himself at the center of a national conversation. "Are you okay?" Melania's voice came from the doorway, breaking his focus. He turned to her, his expression a mix of exhaustion and wonder. "I didn't think it would get this big," he admitted. Melania smiled, walking over to sit beside him. "That's the thing about truth, Barron. When you speak it, people feel it." Barron looked down at his hands, the weight of her words settling over him. "I just hope they don't forget," he said softly. "They won't," Melania replied, placing a hand on his. "Because you didn't just give them words. You gave them hope." And in that moment, Barron realized that maybe, just maybe, he had started something far greater than himself. In the days following Barron Trump's speech, the momentum it had created showed no signs of slowing. Social media continued to churn out heartfelt reactions, grassroots movements were gaining traction, and conversations about unity and empathy rippled across the country. Yet, amidst all this, Barron himself remained introspective, unsure of how to process the whirlwind he had unwittingly unleashed. Sitting by the window in his New York bedroom one evening, Barron gazed out at the city lights. The world outside was alive, buzzing with energy, but inside, he felt a strange sense of stillness. His phone sat on the desk beside him, lighting up every few seconds with notifications, tweets, messages, articles dissecting his speech. He had tried to keep up at first, but the sheer volume of it all had become overwhelming. Melania's soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "May I come in?" she asked, peeking inside. "Yeah," Barron replied, his voice quiet but welcoming. She walked over, her footsteps gentle on the hardwood floor, and sat down beside him. For a moment, they both looked out at the city, the silence between them comforting. "You've been quiet," Melania observed, her tone filled with maternal concern. Barron shrugged. "Just thinking," he said. "It's a lot, Mom. All of this. I didn't expect it to become this big." Melania placed a hand on his arm. "When you speak from the heart, Barron, people listen. You touched something in them. That's not a small thing." Barron turned to her, his brow furrowed. "But what if it doesn't last?" he asked. "What if everything I said just fades away, like so many other speeches people forget?" Melania's expression softened, and she took a moment before answering. "It might," she admitted. "But that doesn't mean it wasn't worth saying. You planted a seed, Barron. Sometimes, it takes time for seeds to grow." Meanwhile, the nation continued to grapple with the impact of Barron's words. At a church in Texas, Pastor Williams stood at the pulpit, addressing his congregation. "This week we heard a message from a young man, a message about listening, about finding common ground," he said, his voice resonating through the room. "And I couldn't help but think, what if we all took that message to heart? What if, instead of arguing with our neighbors, we reached out to them? What if we truly listened?" The congregation nodded in agreement, their expressions thoughtful. Among them sat a woman in her 50s, clutching her Bible tightly. After the service, she approached the pastor. "Pastor," she said, her voice trembling, "I haven't spoken to my sister in 5 years. We had a falling out over politics, and I don't even remember what we were fighting about anymore. But after hearing that young man's speech, and after hearing your sermon, I think it's time I called her." Pastor Williams smiled warmly. "It's never too late to mend what's broken," he said. "Go make that call." Back in New York, Barron was trying to adjust to his newfound role as a reluctant symbol of hope. He had always been a private person, preferring the quiet over the spotlight, and now the sudden attention felt both humbling and overwhelming. At dinner one evening, his siblings gathered around the table, sharing updates about their work and lives. But tonight, the conversation inevitably turned to Barron. "You really shook things up, little brother," Eric said with a grin, raising his glass. "I don't think any of us saw that coming." Ivanka nodded, her expression more serious. "You did something important, Barron. You gave people something to think about. That's no small feat." Barron shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure how to respond. "I just said what I felt," he said. "I wasn't trying to make a statement or anything." "That's why it worked," Ivanka replied, her voice steady. "Because it was real." Donald Trump, who had been quietly observing the conversation, finally spoke up. "You've got a gift, Barron," he said, his tone uncharacteristically subdued. "You've got the ability to connect with people in a way that's different from the rest of us. Use it wisely." Barron looked at his father, surprised by the rare moment of vulnerability in his words. "I'll try," he said simply. As the week wore on, Barron began to understand the depth of the impact his speech had made. Letters started arriving at the Trump residence, handwritten notes from people across the country. One letter, from a woman in Iowa, read, "Dear Barron, I don't usually pay attention to politics, but your words stopped me in my tracks. My husband and I have been on opposite sides of every political debate for years, and it's caused so much pain in our marriage. After hearing your speech, we decided to sit down and really listen to each other. For the first time in years, I feel hope. Thank you." Barron read the letter twice, his chest tightening with emotion. He hadn't expected to reach people in such a personal way, and the realization both humbled and strengthened him. He placed the letter carefully in a box on his desk, alongside others he had received, and sat back in his chair. "Maybe this is just the beginning," he thought. "Maybe there's more I can do." And as the city lights flickered outside his window, Barron felt a quiet resolve take root within him. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he believed that his voice could be a part of the solution. And that, he realized, was enough to keep going. As the days turned into weeks, the echoes of Barron Trump's speech continued to ripple across the nation. It became a cultural moment, dissected by pundits, embraced by everyday Americans, and even woven into sermons and classrooms. Yet for Barron, the newfound attention felt both overwhelming and deeply personal. He had spoken from his heart, not expecting to ignite such a firestorm, and now he found himself at the center of a national conversation he wasn't entirely prepared for. One quiet evening, Barron sat alone in the Trump family's New York residence. The city lights twinkled faintly through the large windows of his room, casting long shadows across the walls. On his desk sat a growing pile of letters from people across the country, some filled with gratitude, others with skepticism, but all acknowledging the impact of his words. Among the letters lay an envelope marked with a Texas postmark, the handwriting delicate but firm. Curious, Barron opened it carefully and began to read. "Dear Barron," it began, "I'm a retired teacher who's seen more elections and political turmoil than I care to count. I've always believed that words matter, but lately, it feels like they've been used to divide us rather than bring us together. Your speech reminded me of what I tell my grandchildren. Change doesn't start in Washington. It starts in our homes, in our communities, in how we treat one another. Thank you for reminding me of that truth." Barron leaned back in his chair, the letter resting in his hands. The weight of the words settled over him like a warm blanket. He hadn't just reached his peers or the younger generation, he had touched people across all walks of life. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a small smile. Downstairs, Melania and Donald Trump sat together in the grand living room, discussing the aftermath of Barron's speech. "He's handling this better than I thought he would," Donald admitted, sipping his coffee. "I expected him to feel crushed under all this attention, but he's holding his own." Melania nodded, her expression thoughtful. "He's more resilient than we've given him credit for," she said. "But I also think he feels the weight of it all, like it's his responsibility to make people see what he sees." Donald set his mug down, leaning forward slightly. "Do you think he regrets it?" he asked, his tone unusually soft. "No," Melania said firmly. "He's not the kind of person who regrets doing the right thing. He's just trying to figure out what comes next." What came next, however, was a question Barron grappled with daily. While his words had sparked conversations and movements, he wondered if they could lead to real, lasting change. One afternoon, he decided to step away from the whirlwind of attention and visit a place that had always grounded him, the library near his old school, St. Andrew's Episcopal. Walking through the familiar doors, Barron felt a sense of calm wash over him. The smell of old books and the soft hum of quiet conversations reminded him of simpler times. He made his way to a secluded corner, pulling a book from the shelf at random. As he flipped through its pages, he heard a voice behind him. "Excuse me, are you Barron Trump?" He turned to see a young woman, no older than 20, clutching a notebook. Her face was a mixture of awe and hesitation. "Yes," he said, offering a polite smile. "That's me." She took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "Your speech, it made me think about my own family. My dad and I haven't spoken in years because of political stuff, but after I heard you, I decided to call him. We're meeting for dinner next week." Barron's heart swelled with a mix of pride and humility. "That's brave of you," he said sincerely. "I hope it goes well." She nodded, her eyes shining. "It already feels like a step in the right direction. You reminded me that it's not about who's right or wrong, it's about connection." As she walked away, Barron sat back in his chair, her words echoing in his mind. It's about connection. That was the heart of his message, and hearing it reflected back to him brought a sense of clarity he hadn't felt before. Back at home that evening, Barron joined his family for dinner. The table was filled with lively conversation, but tonight, Barron felt compelled to speak up. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice cutting through the chatter, "about what I said during the speech, and what I need to do next." The table fell silent, all eyes turning to him. "I don't want this to just be a moment people remember," Barron continued. "I want it to mean something. I want to help create spaces where people can talk, really talk, like that girl I met today who reconnected with her dad. I don't know how yet, but I think that's what I need to do." Ivanka smiled warmly. "That sounds like a big undertaking," she said. "But if anyone can do it, it's you." Donald nodded, a rare look of approval crossing his face. "It's not easy to turn words into action," he said. "But if you're serious about this, we'll support you." Barron met his father's gaze, his resolve strengthening. "I am," he said simply. As the family resumed their meal, Barron felt a quiet sense of purpose settle over him. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew he couldn't stop now. His speech had been the beginning, but it was up to him to carry the momentum forward. And as the night wore on, Barron allowed himself to imagine what could come next, a future where connection, understanding, and unity weren't just ideals, but a reality he could help build, one conversation at a time. In a world where division often overshadows connection, Barron Trump's heartfelt speech reminds us of a simple yet powerful truth: change begins with each of us. His message, calling for unity, empathy, and honest conversations, is a challenge to rethink how we engage with those around us. It's not about agreeing on everything, it's about listening, understanding, and taking small steps toward a better tomorrow. This story isn't just about Barron or his moment on the national stage. It's about all of us. It's a reminder that no matter who we are or where we come from, our words and actions have the power to inspire change. What could our world look like if we chose kindness over anger, connection over division, and action over indifference? If this story touched your heart, we invite you to be part of the change. Hit the like button to show your support for the message of unity. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and challenge us to be better. And most importantly, share this video with your friends and family to spread this message of hope far and wide. We'd love to hear from you. What part of this story resonated with you the most? How do you think we can bring more unity into our communities? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your voice matters, and together, we can start the conversations that lead to real change. Let's build a future we can all be proud of, one step, one word, one action at a time.